A queen, a snake, and a 2,000-year-old question. In a sealed palace room in Alexandria, a queen lay dead on a golden couch. Beside her, two of her most loyal handmaidens lay dying too. No wound, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just a strange, deep calm, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Her name was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and for 2,000 years the world has told the same story about her final hour. That she pressed a venomous snake to her skin and let it end her life on her own terms rather than be dragged through the streets of Rome in chains. It is one of the most famous deaths in history. It may also be almost entirely wrong. Because the writers who gave us that story were not in the room. They were not even born yet. Some wrote 100 years after she died, working from rumor, court gossip, and Roman propaganda designed to make an enemy queen look both dangerous and doomed. So what actually killed Cleopatra? Was it truly a snake smuggled past armed guards in a basket of figs? Was it a carefully mixed poison chosen by a brilliant, highly educated queen who knew exactly what she was doing? Or was the real story simply too useful for Rome to ever tell straight? Today, we open the case file on the woman history remembers as a seductress, but who was, in truth, one of the sharpest political minds of the ancient world. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and the death that Rome turned into a legend, born to a dying dynasty. To understand her death, we have to start nearly 70 years earlier, with her birth into a family already teetering on the edge. Cleopatra was born around 69 BC in Alexandria, into the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek-speaking rulers descended from one of Alexander the Great's own generals. For nearly 3 centuries, her family had ruled Egypt from the outside, Macedonian kings and queens sitting on an ancient African throne, rarely even bothering to learn the local language. Her father was Ptolemy XII, a pharaoh so unpopular with his own people that the Romans nicknamed him Auletes, the flute player, for his taste in music over statecraft. Her mother's identity remains genuinely uncertain, one of the many gaps in the record that later let people project almost anything onto Cleopatra then and now. What is certain is the world she was born into. A once mighty kingdom, now deeply in debt to Rome, a royal family famous for turning on itself, and a throne that had a nasty habit of getting its occupants killed. Most children born into this dynasty did not get old age to worry about. Cleopatra would have to be smarter and harder than any of them just to survive her own family. Alexandria, the greatest city on earth. If Cleopatra had one advantage, it was her city. Alexandria was not just the capital of Egypt, it was arguably the intellectual capital of the entire ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great himself, it boasted the tallest structure on the planet, the Great Lighthouse of Pharos, guiding ships in from a harbor packed with traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. At its heart stood the library and the museum, a combined research center and university that drew the greatest scholars, mathematicians, and physicians of the age. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by this world of ideas, and she absorbed it hungrily. Ancient writers say she spoke as many as 9 languages, and that she was the only ruler in her entire Greek dynasty who bothered to learn Egyptian, the language of the people she ruled. She studied medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, and statecraft, trained not to be a decoration on a throne, but to actually run a kingdom. In a family famous for treachery, that education would become her sharpest weapon. Because on the Ptolemaic throne, knowledge was not just power, it was survival. A family built on blood and betrayal. There was a darker tradition running through Cleopatra's family, one that shaped nearly everyone she was closest to. To keep the bloodline sacred, Ptolemaic rulers frequently married their own siblings, brothers and sisters, crowned together as husband and wife. It was meant to preserve divine authority. In practice, it produced a royal court riddled with rivalry, since a sibling was also, by definition, a co-ruler and a potential rival for the throne. When Cleopatra's father died in 51 BC, he left the kingdom jointly to Cleopatra, then about 18, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who she was expected to marry in the traditional style. It was less a partnership than a ticking clock. Both were teenagers. Both had ambitious advisors whispering in their ears, and both, quite quickly, wanted the throne for themselves alone. Within a year, the co-rule collapsed into open conflict, a power struggle that would pull in the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world and change the course of Cleopatra's life forever. Egypt was about to become a battlefield for something much bigger than a family feud. A teenage queen fights for her throne. Ptolemy XIII's advisors moved fast, forcing Cleopatra out of Alexandria and off the throne entirely. She was barely 20 years old, exiled from her own capital, with her brother's court now firmly in control. Most royals in her position simply vanished from history at this point, quietly removed by a rival with the crown already secured. Cleopatra refused to disappear. She fled east into Syria and began raising an army of her own, gathering mercenaries and allies willing to back her claim by force. By 48 BC, she had marched that army back toward Egypt's border, ready to fight her own brother for the throne their father had left them to share. It was a bold, dangerous gamble for someone so young, betting everything on her ability to outmaneuver a royal court that had already tried to erase her once. And then, just as the two Ptolemaic armies faced off, an outside force arrived that would change everything. A Roman general, chasing his greatest rival across the Mediterranean, sailed into Alexandria's harbor. His name was Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra was about to make sure he could not ignore her. The general who made her a queen again. Julius Caesar had come to Alexandria hunting his defeated rival, Pompey the Great, only to find that Ptolemy's court had already had Pompey murdered, presenting Caesar with the head as a grim gift. Caesar was reportedly disgusted rather than pleased, and he settled into the royal palace to sort out Egypt's chaotic succession dispute himself. Cleopatra, still barred from the city by her brother's forces, needed a way inside that would not get her killed on sight. According to a famous, much-loved story, she had herself smuggled past the guards, rolled inside a carpet, or possibly a simple bedroll, and delivered directly to Caesar's chambers. Whether every detail of that entrance is true or slightly embellished by later writers, the effect was real. Cleopatra got her audience, and she used it. She was fluent, brilliant, and utterly unafraid of one of the most powerful men alive, and Caesar was won over, both by her political case and, soon after, by Cleopatra herself. With the Roman military backing now behind her, the balance of power in Alexandria flipped overnight. Fighting broke out between Caesar's forces and Ptolemy's, and by the time it ended, young Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned in the Nile, fleeing the battle. Cleopatra was Pharaoh again, this time with Rome's most powerful general standing beside her. A son named for a dictator. With her brother gone, Cleopatra technically married her remaining younger brother, another Ptolemy, to satisfy tradition, while her real partnership was with Caesar. In 47 BC, she gave birth to a son she named Ptolemy Caesar, though history remembers him by his nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Julius Caesar ever formally acknowledged the boy as his own remains disputed, but Cleopatra certainly promoted him that way, minting images and building a public narrative of a divine union between Egypt and Rome. She even traveled to Rome itself, staying as Caesar's guest in a stunning display of just how far her fortunes had turned, from exiled teenager to a queen entertained in the heart of the Roman Republic. It was a triumphant, dazzling chapter, it did not last. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Roman Senate, stabbed to death by a group of senators who feared he was becoming a king in all but name. Cleopatra's most powerful protector was gone in an instant, and Rome itself plunged into chaos, a civil war between Caesar's allies and his assassins. Cleopatra fled back to Egypt to wait, watch, and figure out who would come out on top. The woman who sailed as a goddess. Out of that Roman civil war rose two new power brokers, Octavian, Caesar's own great-nephew and adopted heir, and Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general. Together they crushed Caesar's assassins, then split the Roman world between them, with Antony taking charge of the wealthy eastern provinces, right next door to Egypt. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to answer questions about her loyalty during the recent conflict. Rather than arrive as a nervous subject, Cleopatra chose spectacle. She sailed up the river to meet him on a barge with gilded stern and purple sails, reclining beneath a golden canopy, dressed as the goddess Venus, attendants around her costumed as cherubs and nymphs. It was pure theater, and it was calculated genius. Antony, the story goes, was instantly captivated. But this was never simply romance for its own sake. Cleopatra needed Rome's protection to keep Egypt independent and her throne secure. Antony needed Egypt's staggering wealth to fund his own ambitions in the East. What began as a political negotiation between a queen and a general would grow into one of history's most famous partnerships, part genuine passion, part high-stakes alliance with an empire hanging in the balance. An alliance sealed in love and power. Cleopatra and Antony's relationship deepened over the following years, blending personal devotion with hard political calculation in a way that was almost impossible to separate. She bore him 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony, meanwhile, spent long stretches based in Alexandria, ruling much of the Roman East in partnership with Cleopatra's resources and her formidable political instincts. For Cleopatra, the arrangement offered something her entire family had failed to secure for a generation: real protection from Roman annexation, backed by the empire's own leading general. For Antony, Egypt's grain, gold, and fleet gave him the resources to compete with Octavian back in Rome. It looked, for a while, like a genuinely powerful partnership, a queen and a general ruling half the known world between them. But every gift Cleopatra received, every child born, every honor Antony granted her, was being carefully recorded far away in Rome by a rival who was quietly building the case that Antony had gone native, seduced and controlled by a foreign queen. Octavian was patient, and he was about to turn that patience into a devastating propaganda war. Gifts fit for a queen and a war waiting to happen. In 34 BC, Antony staged a lavish public ceremony in Alexandria, known to history as the Donations of Alexandria. Seated on golden thrones before a huge crowd, Antony declared Caesarion the true son and heir of Julius Caesar, and handed out vast territories across the Roman East to Cleopatra and her children as client rulers. To Cleopatra, it may have looked like securing her dynasty's future. To Rome, watching from a distance, it looked like a Roman general giving away Roman territory to a foreign queen and her children, one of whom directly challenged Octavian's own claim as Caesar's true heir. Octavian seized on the moment. He read Antony's private will aloud to the Roman Senate, whether legally or not remains debated, revealing that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome. The message landed exactly as Octavian intended. Antony was no longer a Roman hero. He was a man who had abandoned Rome for an Eastern queen. Octavian did something clever and telling next. He did not formally declare war on Antony, a fellow Roman. He declared war on Cleopatra alone, casting the coming conflict not as a Roman civil war, but as Rome defending itself against a dangerous foreign queen. Rome's war against a woman. What followed was one of history's most effective smear campaigns, and Cleopatra was its central target. Roman poets and politicians painted her as a scheming Eastern temptress who had corrupted a great Roman general with wine, luxury, and seduction, stripping him of his manhood and his loyalty to Rome. It was a useful story on every level. It let Octavian attack Antony without technically starting a civil war against a fellow citizen. It played on Roman anxieties about foreign wealth and foreign women, and it conveniently erased the reality that Cleopatra was a serious head of state, negotiating as an equal, not a helpless seductress pulling strings from the shadows. Almost everything modern audiences think they know about Cleopatra, the endless obsession with her beauty and allure above all else, traces back to this Roman propaganda machine, repeated and embellished for centuries afterward. The real Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, managed a kingdom's finances, commanded a navy, and had outmaneuvered plots against her own life since she was a teenager. But that version of her was far less useful to Octavian than a simple, seductive villain. So that is the version Rome wrote down. And for 2,000 years, most of the world simply believed it. The battle that decided the world. By 31 BC, the propaganda war became a real one. Octavian's fleet and Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces met off the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium, in a battle that would decide who ruled the Roman world. The engagement did not go as planned. Partway through the chaotic naval battle, Cleopatra's squadron withdrew and sailed for open water, and Antony, in a decision debated by historians ever since, abandoned his own fleet to follow her. Was it a coordinated tactical retreat that went badly wrong, or panic? Or simply 2 people choosing each other over an unwinnable fight? The ancient sources, hostile to Cleopatra from the start, blame her cowardice for the entire disaster. The truth is almost certainly more complicated. What is certain is the result. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were shattered, their alliance's momentum broken in a single afternoon. The 2 fled back to Egypt with what remained of their fleet, while Octavian's forces methodically swept up the wreckage of their former empire behind them. The countdown to the end had begun, and everyone involved could feel it. The Fall of Alexandria. Over the following months, Octavian advanced steadily on Egypt, absorbing what remained of Antony's forces along the way, with promises of mercy for defectors. Cleopatra, back in Alexandria, began preparing for the worst, while still probing for any possible deal that might let her keep her throne, or at least secure a future for her children. Some ancient accounts claim she stockpiled treasure in a mausoleum, along with flammable materials, ready to burn it all rather than let Octavian claim Egypt's wealth for himself. A final piece of leverage from a queen who never stopped negotiating. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces finally reached Alexandria itself. In the confusion of the city's fall, Antony received false word that Cleopatra had already died. In grief, he fell on his own sword, a traditional Roman soldier's death, only to learn, as he lay dying, that the report had been wrong. He was carried to Cleopatra, who was already barricaded inside her mausoleum and reportedly died in her arms. Rome's most famous power couple had lost everything. Now only Cleopatra remained, alone in a sealed tomb, with the conqueror of the ancient world closing in outside the walls, a queen cornered. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive, not out of mercy, but because a captured foreign queen, marched in chains through Rome in his victory triumph, would be the ultimate symbol of his total conquest of Egypt. Cleopatra understood exactly what that fate would mean. A public humiliation designed to erase everything she had built and everything her dynasty had stood for. According to the ancient sources, she negotiated cautiously with Octavian's representatives, testing whether any version of her throne or at least her children's futures, could survive the surrender. Some accounts describe her attempting to take her own life at this point, before being caught and disarmed by Octavian's guards, who kept her under close watch afterward. Whatever the exact sequence, one thing was clear on both sides. Cleopatra had no intention of walking through Rome as a trophy of Octavian's victory. She was, by every account, still thinking clearly, still calculating, still searching for a way to control her own ending, even trapped and guarded in her own palace. And in mid-August of 30 BC, according to tradition on the 12th day, she made her final move, one that ancient writers turned into one of history's most enduring legends. The death in the palace. The traditional story is vivid and precise, at least on the surface. Cleopatra, the legend says, arranged to have a venomous snake and asp smuggled into her chambers hidden inside a basket of figs, delivered past Octavian's guards without their knowledge. Sealed away with her two most loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian, she dressed in her full royal regalia, wrote a final letter to Octavian, pleading to be buried beside Antony, and then, the story goes, deliberately let the snake bite her. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke in, they reportedly found Cleopatra already dead on a golden couch, Iris dying at her feet, and Charmian, barely still standing, adjusting the queen's crown one last time before she too collapsed. It is a haunting, cinematic scene, and it has shaped how the world has pictured Cleopatra's death for 2,000 years, in paintings, plays, and films. There is just one significant problem. The writers who left us this story were not eyewitnesses. They were working generations later, from second-hand accounts filtered through the very propaganda machine that had spent a decade painting Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign queen. So how reliable is the snake story, really? To answer that, we need to look closely at who actually wrote it down and when. What the ancient writers actually said. Our main sources for Cleopatra's death are the Greek biographer Plutarch, writing about 130 years after she died, and the Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing roughly 200 years after the events he describes. Neither man was present in Alexandria in 30 BC. Both were working from earlier accounts, court records, and the oral traditions that had grown up around one of the most famous deaths in the ancient world, traditions already well filtered through Roman politics by the time they wrote them down. Even Plutarch, our earliest and most detailed source, admits openly that nobody could say for certain exactly how Cleopatra died. He lists the snake theory alongside a rival claim that she used a poisoned hairpin or a hollow comb to introduce toxins into a small wound, and notes that palace guards reportedly found 2 faint puncture marks on her arm, though even that detail comes secondhand. In other words, the ancient world's most trusted historians were themselves uncertain, hedging their accounts even as they wrote them. That should give us real pause before accepting the snake story as settled fact. And when modern scientists finally examined the physical plausibility of that story, the case grew even shakier. Could a snake really have done it? Let's test the traditional story against what we actually know about snakes and their venom. The asp of ancient accounts almost certainly refers to the Egyptian cobra, a snake that could grow well over 6 feet long and was closely tied to Egyptian royal symbolism, appearing on royal crowns as the protective cobra goddess Wadjet. That symbolism made it a poetic choice for a pharaoh's death, but a real cobra bite creates real problems for the story as told. Egyptian cobra venom is a fast-acting neurotoxin that typically causes severe pain, swelling, and visible tissue damage at the bite site, not the serene, painless death the ancient sources describe. Death from a cobra bite can also take many hours and is far from guaranteed, since many bites deliver only a partial dose of venom. Then there is the detail almost every version of the story includes, that not just Cleopatra, but 2 of her attendants died together in the same room. A single snake, even a large one, cannot deliver multiple fatal bites in quick succession, since venom glands need time to refill. Smuggling one snake past armed guards to kill 3 people cleanly and quietly starts to look less like history and more like theater. So if it likely was not a snake, what was it? The poison cocktail theory. In 2010, German historian Christoph Schäfer proposed a very different answer, working with toxicologist Dietrich Mebs to test it scientifically. Ancient Egypt had a genuinely sophisticated understanding of poisons, and surviving papyri even suggest Cleopatra herself had studied their effects, reportedly testing different toxic substances on condemned prisoners to observe how each one killed. Schäfer's theory proposes that Cleopatra chose a carefully measured mixture instead of a snake, most likely combining hemlock, the same poison famously used to execute Socrates, wolfsbane, also known as aconite, and opium. Tested against the historical descriptions, this combination fits remarkably well. It could produce a relatively calm, low-pain death within a few hours, matching Cassius Dio's account of a queen who died looking peaceful rather than in agony. Critically, it is also a mixture that could be measured out precisely enough to be shared deliberately among 3 women preparing to die together by choice, something no single snake bite could ever reliably achieve. It is a far less cinematic answer than a hidden cobra in a basket of figs. It is also, according to the physical evidence, considerably more believable. So if the poison theory fits the facts so much better, why did the snake story win? Why everyone believed the snake? Anyway, the snake story survived for 2,000 years for reasons that have very little to do with toxicology and everything to do with symbolism and propaganda. In Egyptian royal tradition, the cobra represented divine protection and pharaonic authority itself, the sacred uraeus worn on royal crowns for centuries. A death by royal snake framed Cleopatra's suicide as one final act of pharaonic power, defying Octavian and choosing her own fate as a goddess queen, rather than as a defeated captive quietly swallowing poison. For Octavian, back in Rome, the snake story carried a very different, equally useful meaning. It let him claim he had been personally outwitted by a cunning, almost supernatural foreign queen, which made his eventual triumph over Egypt sound even more impressive, while conveniently avoiding the far less flattering possibility that his own guards had simply failed to prevent a queen from acquiring poison. According to Roman accounts, Octavian even had a statue of Cleopatra with a snake coiled around her arm, carried through the streets in his victory triumph, permanently fusing the image in the public imagination. A vivid, symbolic legend, retold for centuries in art and literature, ultimately proved more durable than the quieter, more plausible reality. That happens more often in history than most people realize. Weighing the evidence. So let's lay the theories side by side, the way we would any other cold case. Death by a single smuggled asp. Dramatic and symbolically perfect, but medically shaky, given the timing, the described calm, and the deaths of 3 separate people. Murder ordered by Octavian, dressed up afterward as a noble suicide. Possible in theory, but Octavian genuinely wanted Cleopatra alive for his triumph, making her death a serious setback to his own plans. Not something he had reason to arrange. Death by a carefully prepared poison mixture, chosen deliberately by a queen who had studied toxicology her entire life. This theory best explains the calm, controlled nature of the deaths described by ancient writers, and the fact that 3 people died together by choice in a way no snakebite plausibly could. None of these theories can be proven with total certainty, not without physical remains to examine, and Cleopatra's body has never been found. But weighing what we know of ancient toxicology, snake behavior, and a queen who reportedly experimented with poisons for years beforehand, the evidence increasingly favors a woman who chose and controlled the manner of her own death, right down to the final chemistry of it. Not a victim of a snake's bite. The architect of her own ending, the tomb that has never been found. Here is the twist that keeps this case genuinely open. Unlike Tutankhamun, whose tomb was found remarkably intact, Cleopatra's final resting place has never been discovered. Ancient sources say she and Antony were buried together in Alexandria, likely near her royal palace complex. But centuries of earthquakes, rising sea levels, and urban rebuilding have swallowed much of ancient Alexandria beneath the modern city and the waters of the harbor. Archaeologists have searched for decades. One prominent excavation, led by archaeologist Kathleen Martinez at the temple site of Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria, has uncovered coins, statues, and a network of tunnels that some believe could be connected to Cleopatra, though no conclusive tomb has ever been confirmed. Without her remains, we cannot run the kind of forensic and toxicological tests that helped solve Tutankhamun's case. No bones to scan, no tissue to sample for poison residue. The truth about Cleopatra's final hours may be sitting somewhere beneath modern Alexandria right now, or it may be lost to the sea forever. Until that tomb is found, if it ever is, the case of exactly how Cleopatra died will remain the best supported theory we have, rather than a closed file. The real face behind the myth. While her death remains debated, the myth-making around Cleopatra's life deserves just as much scrutiny, starting with her appearance. Roman writers and centuries of later art have painted her as history's ultimate seductress, a woman whose beauty alone bent powerful men to her will. The surviving evidence tells a more interesting story. Coins minted during her own reign show a strong-jawed woman with a prominent, hooked nose, striking rather than conventionally soft, likely styled deliberately to project authority and strength, rather than delicate beauty. Even the Greek biographer Plutarch, writing generations later, noted that her beauty was not in itself unparalleled, but that the true force of her presence came from her conversation, her wit, and the sheer charisma of her intelligence. This was a ruler fluent in as many as 9 languages, versed in medicine, philosophy, and finance, who negotiated as an equal with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, 2 of the most powerful men in the ancient world, and kept her kingdom independent from Rome for over 20 years through sheer political skill. Reducing her to a beautiful temptress was never really about accuracy. It was, and still is, one of the oldest ways history has found to shrink a powerful woman down to something smaller and easier to dismiss. The children she left behind. Cleopatra's death did not end her family's story, though it ended it cruelly. Days after her suicide, Octavian ordered the execution of Caesarion, her 17-year-old son with Julius Caesar, reportedly on the advice that the world was not big enough for 2 Caesars. It was a chillingly practical decision, eliminating the one heir who could have challenged Octavian's own claim to Caesar's legacy. Her 3 younger children with Mark Antony were treated very differently. Spared and taken to Rome, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were raised in the household of Octavia, Mark Antony's Roman wife, the very woman their parents' relationship had publicly humiliated. Remarkably, Cleopatra Selene went on to genuine royal success, later married to a North African client king, and ruling as Queen of Mauritania in her own right, carrying a thread of the Ptolemaic bloodline forward into a new generation, in a kingdom on the opposite end of Rome's growing empire. Egypt itself, after nearly 3 centuries, under Cleopatra's dynasty, was formally annexed as a personal territory of Octavian, who would soon after take the name Augustus and become Rome's first emperor. The independent pharaohs of Egypt, a line stretching back thousands of years, had finally, quietly, come to an end. The last pharaoh's legacy. 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognized names from the ancient world, and also one of the most misunderstood. Rome turned her into a cautionary tale, a foreign temptress who nearly corrupted the empire itself, and that image proved remarkably durable, echoed centuries later by Shakespeare's stage, and reimagined again and again by Hollywood. But strip away the propaganda, and a very different figure emerges. A teenage exile who rebuilt her own throne through sheer nerve. A ruler fluent in 9 languages who governed a wealthy, complex kingdom for 2 decades. A stateswoman who negotiated as an equal with the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world, and very nearly changed the outcome of Rome's civil wars entirely. And, in the end, a woman who appears to have controlled even the final chapter of her own story, choosing a calculated death over public humiliation, only to have that final act rewritten by the very empire she had spent her life resisting. The snake in the basket of figs may be the most famous detail in her story. It may also be the least true. What is certain is this: Cleopatra was never simply a beautiful woman who lost. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, and she played a losing hand about as brilliantly as anyone in history ever has. If this journey into the past moved you, stay with the Clue series as we open the next great mystery hidden in the sands of history.